I'm Luis, for those who don't know me. I'm a teacher of English, and I'm researching the intersection of materials development and teacher education. So in my first year, I realized, while I was doing the upgrade, prepared for the upgrade, I realized that, well, I initially started wanting to research the use of the textbook by school teachers in the public system in Chile. And as I read, I realized that had been researched more or less to some point, and although it would have been interesting to see what contribution I could have brought from the context of Chile into the scholarly discussions, then I realized that nobody had really paid attention at how pre-service teachers learn how to write their own materials. And I said, well, this is actually very interesting because it puts together two things that I really like, materials and at the same time teacher education. So I'm exploring that intersection, and I'm hopefully contributing with something interesting, debatable, or novel, or just rubbish. But but you can make very interesting things from rubbish. You can grow plants in organic waste. So I'll be talking about, I just comment on the two big areas in materials development, or materials research actually, because it's a different thing to say materials development. And then I'll describe the context, my research methods, findings, and directions for discussion, and that's what I'm working on at the moment. So, this is very much like an ongoing process. Actually, when I was preparing this morning, I realized that my chapter could have like a sort of important change. After just thinking about the organization of this presentation, I said, well, but my chapter actually can reflect this change, because it's a lot more, it makes a lot more sense than how I had originally designed it. Fine. So in materials development or in materials research, there are two big camps of research. One is Brian Tomlinson leading or pushing, doing a great work in trying to understand materials development materials as curricular artifacts. That is, how to better promote language learning or teaching practices in the schools, and also how to write materials that aim at promoting learning. And at the same time, they have a slight concern with the type of language that they depict in the materials. For example, all the work done by corpora or corpus linguistics also informs this stream of material studies. And on the other hand, we have an area, I'm not sure if it's led by John Gray, though, a teacher, but he's an important person in that area, and he tends to study materials as cultural artifacts. That is, how they bring up ideological or cultural constructs, and what problems that can have in language teaching. Both of them are very interesting, and the findings that I'm coming with in the overall structure of my thesis touch on both fields. Although there's a very big tendency to see materials as this and not that. I think that's very interesting as well. Fine, that's my literary review. Now I'm going to talk to you about the context, and I deleted like a few slides because I thought it wouldn't be relevant to go into that much of detail. Now I regret, but because it would have been interesting. But when I was preparing for my upgrade, I said, well, I need to find a problem here, because there must be something that is problematic. And I realized that materials development is not taught in pre-service teacher education. Do you know what pre-service is? Yeah. Pre-service is when you're training to become a teacher, you haven't yet taught, so you're at the university. Parentheses, in Chile, when you train to be a teacher, you're not yet a professional like you do it in the UK. So in the UK, you normally have a BA, and then you do a PGC, and then you go to teach. In Chile, you need to train for between 4 and 5 years, normally 5, and you do your courses of, in this case, English. You do linguistics, literature, second language acquisition, and at the same time, you'll be doing teacher, like education, like how to teach language, how to teach this, or sociology of education, psychology, all those during the 5 years. I took that program. It took me 5 years to become a teacher. And well, within these 5 years, and in each term, we divide the year in 2 terms, not 3 like here. So the first term, so in the first term, you usually have no less than 5 modules. So, in total, you'd have around 50 modules in your, I had English 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, then introduction to linguistics, applied linguistics, second language acquisition, and so on. Phonetics 1, phonetics 2, blah, 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 and so on. So within all these 50 modules, there was none in my own training for materials development. There was nothing related to materials except 1 unit in the methodology or like didactics modules. And then I realized that in Chile the scenario is not very different. So only 3 of 25 universities belonging to this sort of Russell Group universities, only 3 of them have an explicitly stated module related to materials development. And that resonates very strongly with David Bloch's sociolinguist. I'm bringing in sociolinguistics. In 1991, this is ages ago, he wrote that the assumption seemed to be that material selection, adaptation, and development would take care of itself. And that was almost 30 years ago, like 27? 28 years ago. And things haven't changed much. And I believe it's my personal conviction, you might agree with it or not, that teachers should know how to write their materials. Whether they write them or not in the classroom, that's another thing, but they should know. Or at least be more informed about the decisions that they make about materials. Right. So the question comes naturally, almost. So my main question for my upgrade wrote itself. How do they learn? How do they learn to write their own materials? And I'm trying to answer this question by tackling other more detailed questions that I don't have now, but I'm going to focus on one during this presentation. Yeah? Well, since I'm in the area of teacher education as well, because it's not only about materials, it's about how learners of teaching, how they learn to write materials, I have to get in the field of teacher education. And like about 30 years ago, there were signs of a turn in teacher education, a turn, let's call it the sociocultural turn, in which now the activity of learning to teach was seen as much more complex than it used to be thought of. So today, for example, most people will acknowledge that it is critical to understand how a teacher-learner's activities shape and are shaped by the sociocultural and historical structures present in the professional environment, since they mediate and are mediated by others, following the goals and using culturally constructed physical and symbolic tools. This last bit, using culturally constructed physical and symbolic tools, is what I'm going to be focusing on. Yeah. So far, so good? No questions? So, for example, today most people believe that. I'll give you an example. Like some time ago, like a friend said, "Well, but it's very easy to become a teacher. Just go to uni, they teach you methods, and then you go and do that in the classroom." No, that's not. Even if it was that easy, then your learning of those methods would be strongly influenced by your sociocultural context. So, for example, what happens with different learning cultures? What happens with we normally divide the world in East and West. So there's one big one there already. And then what happens with each local context? So they're all different. Yeah, and also your own personal experiences learning that influences a lot how you teach. So, and because I'm focusing on an activity, I decided to draw on activity theory to structure the study and then to analyze the data. And activity theory is an offshoot of sociocultural theory, so it agrees on the principles. There are some slight differences. This is more collective than individual, so that would be maybe the biggest difference. Or it tends to be as more collective, and it specifies what elements in social context are influencing the activity. Yeah. So an offshoot of sociocultural theory concerned with teaching and learning inquiries, positioning these within the context of specific communities of practice. Yeah. And it considers individual development and the sociocultural environment under the same light. So it puts everyone there. Yeah? And it maps social influences and relationships involved in networks of human activity. Maybe this doesn't say much, but I'm going to make it visual because I read about multimodality. So I'm using what I'm learning. Right. So in activity theory, this is very important. Just to give you a little bit of background on this, if you have heard Vygotsky or Vygotsky, yeah, you maybe are familiar with this triangle. Don't think of this. Yes, have you seen this? Okay. So Vygotsky basically said that learning was mediated by tools. So you get to you develop your own cognition by using tools, symbolic or physical. And then activity theory basically. And the work done after him has added, the bottom of the triangle. Yeah. So they added, for example, that in an activity system, there are rules mediating, cognitive development as well. Yeah. So you see another triangle here. Yeah. So it's not only this one, but this one too, and it's a mess, really. And then. Also, as well, the community as well, an important part of the community, an important part of the community, and there's a community and also mediating learning. You see here, and then there's a division of labor. This is a very Marxist concept, I acknowledge, but I'm not getting that far. So. The division of labor, basically, I understand it as the roles that people take, or the community take in the system. Yeah? And well, the object is what you aim to do, your motive. Well, the subjects are my pre-service teachers. These are the people I'm studying. The community are going to be teacher educators, school teachers, learners. And then they have a goal, an object, and well. And then there's an outcome, which is not necessarily the same object. Yeah. So basically, I'm trying to get what materials they design. So, and I've got the outcome. So I've got the concrete materials, and I also have more or less, a description of what they aim to write, and what they finally wrote. And well, these are my people. Yeah. So I'm focusing on these ones. And for today, I'm going to be these are the pre-service teachers, but the tools is what I want. I'm interested in identifying. Okay. Now, I think the activity of learning to write materials happens in two main contexts. One is a school, and the other one is a university where, the university where they train, and also the schools where they do the practicals. Yep. So, I went to Chile, and I went to these two settings, the university and then the schools. So I interviewed people from the schools and also from the university, and now this is complicated because what happens is that many times these two are at odds. They don't really have the same motives or goals. A very clear one is that the university wants to train teachers. That's their goal, to develop a teacher identity in student teachers, whilst the school has a very clear role. It's to teach kids, yeah, or adolescents. So it's complicated they're in disagreement most of the time. And with this, I want to draw your attention to. Oh no, sorry. No, not yet. Well, I said I wanted to focus on the tools first. Yeah. So what is for me a tool? It's not necessarily a hammer. It can be a hammer, but not really. I am not interested in whether pre-service teachers use hammers or not to write the material, or if they use a computer, no, or software, no. I'm interested in what concepts they have. So this is more related to teacher cognition, if you're familiar with that term. Have you heard of Simon Borg? So Simon Borg, he's also in the sociocultural line. He says that teachers' beliefs are a big driving force in the actions that they take. And those beliefs are really, really hard to change, and they're like multi-influenced by that, basically. Yeah. And so I'm defining tools here and drawing from those three people, Grossman, Smagorinski, and Valencia, to define what a tool is for me. Then I'll go into Simon Borg more, but for now, only this. So what are the tools for me? Principles, frameworks, and ideas about teaching and learning. English or the language arts used by teachers as heuristics guiding their pedagogical decision making. Yeah. So what concepts of teaching are driving the activity of materials design? This is that's my specific question. And also in activity theory, it's very important to consider the systemic contradictions. What are the contradictions? Basically tensions between elements. This is not very harmonious. I already mentioned a big one. So these two are in conflict all the time. They have different goals. But sometimes you have tensions within these elements, or between these elements and within the elements. Sometimes the subject can have their own inner contradiction. A very common one in language teaching is like, we most believe that we teach languages for the purposes of communication, but we acknowledge that it's very difficult to do that in the classroom, right? And we're like in conflict all the time. That's a contradiction, for example. Yeah. But I'm going to detail these four types that in activity theory have been outlined. A primary contradiction is a contradiction within one element of the activity system. For example, the one that I just mentioned. Yep. A secondary contradiction can be a contradiction between two elements. So, 2 points of the triangle. Yep. A tertiary one can be when a more advanced form of, for example, teaching is brought into the school and it's in conflict with the culture of teaching present in the school. Yep. And a quaternary one is when elements of two different settings, for example, here, for example, the object of the university and the object of the school, they are at odds. So they don't really, they're mutually exclusive, basically. And now contradictions are not really negative. They're like a positive thing. If they're like thought of and acted upon, they can be, they actually like a sort of driving force. So when you realize there is a contradiction, then you start like moving things to change that, because you acknowledge that there's a problem. And you make your own decisions. Sometimes you just accept that there is a contradiction, and you just die with it. Or when you find like a way of solving it, you can attempt to solve it. Now, there's an important thing about activity theory, in that it's not only about understanding like activities, but also it has a more pragmatic. Well, it's very pragmatical, right? But it has a more pragmatic avenue in which you identify problems and tensions, and then you try to solve that. So it's a lot. It's like for intervention in, for example, teams, and so they have used it as that as well. Yep. Okay. And well, my study now. I went to study a 5-year teacher education program at a university in the south of Chile. It's actually the same university where I studied, and then I worked there as well. So it was very easy for me to get to that place. I didn't have to knock many doors. I actually didn't knock any. So a thing of doing research is that you become a little bit maybe opportunistic. And I also went to this was more difficult, of course, going to the fourth school. So I had to go and say, hey, I'm doing research in the #1 in the world in education. So I had to sell it. So that's a contradiction, actually, because I don't like doing that, but I had to do it because that's a primary contradiction. It's a contradiction. And I had to sell it. I come from this university. It's like good in education, they say. And so 4 schools opened their doors. Not all of them did. one school I wasn't allowed to because one person at the university said, you'd rather not go to that school because we had a problem there, so the teachers are a bit sensitive, and that may put the pre-service teachers at risk. It can jeopardize their stay there. So I decided not to go there. So I just went to 4 and I interviewed 4 teachers. My methods, well, it's an ethnographically, my English is really, I went to the Hare Krishna and yeah, so anyway. Did you record that? Okay. So, well, if it's an ethnographically, just jump. Well, you had the same problem last year.
I did.
I did this.
Same thing.
You had the same problem last week. Okay. So I did this, and I borrowed concepts from activity theory, as you have noticed already. And then it's 8 pre-service teachers that I worked with most of the time, 8 teacher educators and 4 school teachers. Methods, I did interviews. I conducted also stimulated recalls, with the students. So this is very important because I asked them to write. I didn't ask them to write materials. They had to write materials for the practicum, and I knew because I had worked there that they were going to write a lot of them. So I said, well, can I sit with you and analyze 2 pieces of materials that you have written for your practicum, and can you send them to me right as soon as you finish them? Can you email them to me? And if it is not something if it is not digital, then can you take a picture of it and send it to me? Well, all of them were digital, so they're like pretty much just worksheets or PowerPoints, and I analyzed them, and I designed a simulated recall protocol, and then the next day or within 48 hours we sat and I asked them, like, so what were you thinking when you did this? Or why did you do this and that? And so I got explanations from the design of material. With all the pros and cons that can have. So I'm sure that it's not the best method, but I think it's the best I had for that. So well, and then I did materials analysis for developing the interviews, and then document analysis and observations. So the data that I'm going to be using today comes from all of these. I think, even though I have observations, I think I didn't bring it to this presentation. And the data analysis is thematic, using in vivo and all that. I'm still doing it, so yeah. Okay. So findings. These are 3 pieces of worksheets that they designed. Here we have preparing a CV, a very. This is another chapter, and what the content of the material is, and then my healthy lifestyle, and then something about going to school and means of transport. This is interesting. This is like a picture of one student in the south of Chile going to school, having a really hard time just getting there, and then this one's in the city complaining that the bus is too cramped. Yeah. Right. So what tools have I identified so far? These are going to be the 4 chapters of my thesis. One is about the textbook, the one that I'm going to be talking about today. The other one is the dumbing down of materials, how the idea that the students can't, or that not good enough for something more difficult, primes in this selection of activities, content, etc. And then the prioritization of grammar over content. I spoke about this in the last IATF. Yeah. And then there's something else that I call the receptive turn. Yeah. So the idea that materials are, not the idea, but the tendency to write materials for the promotion of listening and reading mostly, and not speaking and writing. As you can see, I'm very much like TESOL oriented. Yeah. No shame, no shame. Right, the textbook. So what I found in the textbook was basically a secondary contradiction, yeah? In the presence of the textbook in the design of materials. So do you remember what a secondary contradiction is? Yeah, it's a tension between two elements, right?
Yeah.
So the tension that I find here is between the textbook and the division of labor of the pre-service teachers. You know, the roles that the pre-service teachers have. So what I noticed is that the textbook was always fighting with the roles that the pre-service teachers incarnated in the school. Yeah, I mean, it was fighting all that time. It fought until it defeated them. You know? It beat them. Like it won, if you want to put it away. And for example, this quote from one of my participants, he's renouncing his materials design capacities in order to privilege the textbook. I basically prefer to take another activity from the textbook, and then he copied that and put it in his material instead of him writing his own. And what I'm going to be doing now is basically making my points through quotes from the pre-service teachers. And well, this is the tension that I observe here. So the textbook, which is a tool, and the division of labor. So these two are like, in conflict. Carlos, this week I started to implement. The second lesson is next week. I'm going to do an activity from the textbook. By activity, he meant the whole unit. For what I noticed then, and it's a listening. As they come with all the material, with the CD and the list of questions for general and specific information, it even has after listening work. The book really helped me. Yeah? These are pre-service teachers who are expected by the university to write their own material. Yeah? So, and as you can see here, we have a problem. He's cheating the university, basically. Yeah? Yeah. So the school setting. What happens at the school? What elements of the school setting? Do you remember the two triangles? Mm-hmm. So what elements in the school setting affect his division of labor and promote the textbook as an element for reliance? So what we have here is the pre-service teachers rely a lot on the textbook to write their own material. Yep. So, for example, Gabriel here, he says, yes, I mean more than the school itself, the school teacher. So the school teacher is promoting the use of the coursebook. Some teachers, like this one, gives us freedom. Like, right, see the study programs, take a topic from there that you consider relevant, but others would ask you to know that it had to be this, that we should include what they were teaching so that our lesson didn't become, that we didn't cut the thread of what we were studying. So the teachers are all the time saying, do what we are doing, do what we are doing. And even though the teacher here, or Gabriel here, refers to the programs, he's actually using or talking about the textbook as an incarnation of the syllabus. Yeah? So not really the programs. They go and check the textbook and then they take ideas from there. Yeah? And the program leader is very much aware of this. This can be said to be like a primary contradiction as well, because she knows that this is a problem, but we can't do anything. Yeah. So, but I'm not going to go into that. The supervisor reviews. By this, supervisor means the teachers from the university who. The supervisor reviews the lesson plan first, then the pre-service teachers show it to the school teacher, but if the school teacher says no to something that we have allowed to go into the schools, then we don't impose, because the school teachers may simply say no. So if the school teacher says no, then this is how far the university gets. Yeah. And this is later confirmed by one school teacher. See this, she's very strong about this. I don't care about the lesson plan of the girls, meaning the pre-service teachers, or whatever the teacher educator says, because a learner of year 3 of secondary is going to receive the material. Yeah? So I don't care what they are told at the university, what methods they have to use. They have to, write materials for these students, and it might not be what the university says. Yeah? I've got more evidence. Actually, this school teacher had a problem with one. Well, that's another story that I'm going to put in the thesis. But she had a problem with one of the supervisors. The supervisor allowed some material to go to the school, and then the girls were going to print it. And then at the printing, in the printing room, the people printing said, "Oh, this is really rubbish. It's not not even the teachers. They were like, this is not good material. Like, how can you do this and that, or so much space? For example, it was a sheet of paper like this, and only this much had been used. The rest was just blank. And she was really angry when I went to interview her, and this had happened like the same week. Well, and then the supervisor went to the school to observe the pre-service teachers doing their practicum, and the school teacher said, like, "Hi, we had this problem," and the university teacher told the school teacher off in front of her students. So there was an imposition from the university, but then when the school teacher said no, then the university teacher got really like out of a professional role. And well, but she was really angry. She was making this point all the time that no, if from the university, if the staff at the university doesn't match what we want in the school, then no. And then I talked to another school teacher at that school, and she said, well, that teacher from the university is no longer allowed to step in the school. That's serious. Yeah. This is all about material. So all this conflict was just about a worksheet. You see, when you don't pay attention to the worksheet, what can happen? What was I trying to say? Well, the division of labor seems to be highly affected by the school teachers, as well as the use of the textbook as a syllabus. Yep. For example, the same school teacher, she said, in year 3 and 4 of secondary, we don't follow the syllabus. She meant we use the textbook. Yep. So she was talking about this mismatch between the national syllabus and the textbook given by the national authorities. And they didn't match, and they decided to just use the textbook, not the national syllabus. And this is reflected and acknowledged by the pre-service teachers. For example, Francisco, he's like, he got kind of excited about this, and he talked about his experience doing other school teaching practice. There are teachers who say, no, if it doesn't belong to the textbook, it can't be used. And there are schools that tell you, we only work with the textbook. That means that the textbook is the syllabus. And it shouldn't be like that, because I feel the textbook is a supporting material only, not the Bible or the Quran. Yep. And then Miguel, this is funny how they do it. Miguel, the year starts, one opens, when you take the textbook, it's 90 pages. I have 40 days of classes, 90 divided by 4. Okay, I have to cover 2 pages per day. That's how the syllabus is spread. And as a teacher, you have to make all those decisions. For example, my school teacher is now working at the rhythm of the textbook. Yeah? He said it at the beginning that he planned based on the textbook. Yeah? And this seems to be repeated as well in another context, school context. When Marcos, in another school, he said, the while in receptive skill lessons, we usually speak about the pre-while and post, like pre-reading or listening, while reading and listening, post-reading and listening. So the while, so the middle of the while, meaning the while reading part of his material, is on the book. And on the book, what corresponds that day in that unit is complaints. I didn't decide it. So basically, they're leaving their choices, the pedagogical choices that they can make. They're like on the textbook, not on them. So this is what I see the conflict between the textbook and the division of labor of the pre-service teachers. They're there to learn how to teach or to practice, but they're not really making it, or they're not doing it. And what happens at the university? So the division of labor also appears to be constrained by the university setting. Yeah. For example, Fernanda, she's recalling here. This is not really from the university. Sorry. Oh no, yeah, I know why I put them together, because this phrase here reflects what they are asking. Yep. So, Fernanda, it's called Stepping Up. This is a book used at the school, but this is something that comes from the university. So it's a very systematic book. So I take ideas to work from there. The ideas of, for example, the keywords. I see, for example, the quantity of words that each text has. And so I rely on that a bit. And well, I designed this material based on that. Yep. And then in the same stimulated recall interview, she said, and the textbook is in PPP. Have you heard PPP before? Presentation, practice, and production. It's a very traditional method of language teaching, which, like, also, it's curious that they refer to this as something more progressive, as very communicative, but it's not really. Well, it can be, but it really, like, on practice, it struggles to become communicative. And the textbook is in PPP because, the presentation, everything. I think she didn't know the two. So then there's production. So you see, many pieces in between and production. Sometimes it's writing or sometimes it's speaking. It's just like how the TEFL staff ask us to organize our material. Yes, it's good material. So she sees here what the university is saying, like you should write materials or prepare lessons in this model of teaching, and then she said, oh, the textbook actually reflects that. And now there's a problem though, because naturally I went to see the textbook, and it isn't PPP. It's no presentation, practice, and production. She means pre, while, post. So there's so the organization of receptive skills, and this is what I'm going to be talking about in another chapter, she understands it as PPP. So she's mixing methodology with a very formulaic way of organizing receptive skill lessons. And then I went to see the requirements of the course, and I saw the practicum regulations at the university. And it says, the activities of beginning, pre, while, and post, and systematization are explained and outlined clearly. So they are asked at the university to present this in their material, and they see this reflected in the textbook. So that's why they rely on it as well. So this comes from the university. And then, as it says here, 13 out of 15 of the materials that I analyzed are done with this structure. And also their beliefs. So the beliefs of the community at the university, they're very important. Right, so this teacher educator, she believes that even novice teachers, they shouldn't be writing their own material. Yeah, she was very strong about this. No, you shouldn't write material because, no, why would you? There's textbooks. And there's also this discourse of, it hasn't been, what was the word she used? When you have it tested by other people or analyzed by other people and validated. That was the word she used. Yeah, it hasn't been validated. No, if you write your own material, then who validates that? Like, that was like in my mind. Well, you, it's your students. Well, the textbook is as your lifesaver. You see, now I believe that maybe after about 5 years, one stands well in their shoes and says, right, I now know that there's the textbook. It helps me. It's really useful, but I can use anything around me in the classroom as a resource. So she does agree that you could write your material, but only after some years. But I insist, it's a matter of great expertise. Unless you are a novice teacher who is really creative and with good discipline control and very histrionic, etc., it has to do with that too. Yeah. So she basically removes designing materials from what a teacher of English can do. And so I argue that this type of beliefs then end up in this. So with the other teacher educators, it was the use of the textbook. And this, Fernanda here is talking about her own language learning experience at the university. And she saw that some teacher educators relied a lot, basically reflecting this, or maybe the same teacher educator, like, basing the classes only on the textbook, or mostly on it. Yeah? And she was very aware of that. With the other teacher, it was the use of a textbook, and they followed the textbook dynamics a lot. When she says dynamics, I'm pretty sure she's speaking about the methodology as well. Yeah? Headway, have you heard of this one? Yeah, it's like that. And it was always the same. In the end, the class was monotonous, and we had to follow the rhythm of the textbook. And then the tests were something else. see this. This is in the interview. I conducted the interview at the beginning of March, and then the first and second simulator recalls were like in April or May, or in June even. And this is the second simulator recall. So it's been like 3 months, more or less. And Fernanda was the one. We were talking about her material, and so I asked her if she noticed any difference between the first material that she wrote and this one. And she said this. The previous material was like my idea. And now that I know more the class and the textbook, my material is a bit different. So she's basically saying now my material is defined by the textbook and not the it's not my idea, she says. It's not my idea anymore, it's the textbook. Yeah. So the textbook is now becoming their own material. Yeah. And then she also says, like, it's not here, but she also refers to the fact that I asked her if the teacher, the school teacher, had any influence on how she wrote her material, and she said, no, the textbook. So it's just the textbook. So the textbook is actually, you know, living outside the activity of designing even the school teachers. And I find this very problematic. Maybe this is the root of the whole problem. This is, you know, this is where it all comes from. So the textbook tends to be constructed as an artifact of inherent authority. For example, Miguel, I dare say that textbooks like Headway are many years old and that it's been proven that they work, so to speak. Yeah, and then look at this teacher educator. I like Headway because it's based on the communicative approach, and there's no doubt about that. Right? So they don't question these artifacts. It's like, oh no, you know, it's what, maybe, I'm probably, you know, exaggerating my conclusions, but it was written by Oxford, let's use it. Something like that. Or I get that impression. I have to get to that point yet, so this is not my discussion. But I mean, it is, but not what I have written so far. And then, because the content, the linguistic contents, she's talking about Headway, of vocabulary, grammar, they are what they have to be according to the level. And that's okay, it's well graded. Yeah. But we don't know what level she's talking about. So it's complicated to see what the linguistic contents are, what the right level is, whether the right levels for my students or for. And this is in the context of using Headway as a textbook to train teachers of English. Yeah. And then you can see, for example, these beliefs being more or less acknowledged by Gabriel, who this guy was really aware, but sadly he had to he couldn't continue in the study because he left his practicum. He decided to finish it the next year. But I was lucky enough to have him in one interview, but his insights were really good. He was writing the thesis when he was speaking, basically. And the 2011 cohort is the first one to be in a competency-based course structure. He's talking about the organization of the whole program. So he's saying in 2011 the course structure changed. We now have a different Maya curricular. We have a different structure, and that meant changes for the modules. For example, the English language modules were no longer called like that, but linguistic competence. So they used to be called English, and now they're called linguistic competence. Although the way of working was the same. And then I probed him, like, what do you mean by the same? And he said, well, what I remember is that, for example, the material was the same, the textbooks were the same. The only difference was that one had to achieve a certain level. So they include these international examinations in the end of the modules. But he said, whatever they did, it's basically the same because we use the same material. Yeah. Okay, so now the conclusions that are, or discussions that I'm trying to take this analysis to is, on the way of these two quotes, basically. So the novice teacher becomes socialized into a professional culture with certain goals, shared values, and standards of conduct. So basically, what I'm saying is that these pre-service teachers are being enculturated into the belief that the textbook is an artifact of inner authority that you don't question, that it can, and that it apparently should be allowed in in the view of one of the teacher educators, to take your decision making, to make decisions for you. And as a consequence of that, then I rely on research, more or less. I have to expand this. Sorry for the. He says that the over-reliance on the teachers on the course books leaves important pedagogical decisions to the textbook rather than the teachers, and it may make the pre-service teachers become just technicians, reducing their roles to only delivering the material made by others. So what I'm seeing here is that the whole education that teachers get at the university is thrown overboard, because the textbook apparently has more educational value than their own personas. And also I'm trying to take the conversation of this analysis into the direction of what happens from a more socio-linguistic point of view, what happens with the construction of these artifacts as, authorities. What is there about the textbook that is so valuable and respected and, and open, the door to get into my classroom so easily? So there might be something about, for example, linguistic imperialism, and also, the hegemony of English language teaching from countries of the Banner Group or the Inner Circle. Not in the Inner Circle, just the UK or the United States. So maybe you can, help me, give me some insights into where I can take these discussions. I haven't finished yet. Yeah, I finished. Can I see it?
Sure, of course.
No, I don't come.
Regarding the last question, like many years ago, one of my teachers at university, I'm also a teacher, we were discussing like the use of technology in the classroom and how important it was for the students and blah, blah, blah. And the teacher told me, he was very old, like 80 years old by now, and he told me, yeah, it might be motivating for the student, but the same way I look at the book. And the same, my teachers look at the blackboard. And the same, those teachers before look at different artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
See? So it's not only the textbook, but apparently there's something mediating the teacher and the student, and basically that's the most important thing, right?
Hmm. Well, it can be your own material, so.
But the way you look at the materials, I don't know how to put it. Let me just think about it.
Think about it. We'll be back with you in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I just need to ask about something regarding the context itself. Could you just make it clearer for me? I may miss it when you were presenting. So on national level,
Mm-hmm.
at schools, there's a curriculum which is promoted by the authority, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And that is designed in Chile, or is it
The-
like a
the-
company like
the curriculum?
Yeah, the English textbooks.
The textbooks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are they from like Headways and things like that?
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay.
Well, Headway is chosen by the university because they say,
Yeah.
when you enroll in the program, you say, well, we use this textbook to train teachers. So the Ministry of Education doesn't really have, in the first place, it doesn't provide materials for training teachers of English. It does provide guidelines, but not materials. And so the universities choose their own textbook. That's up to them. But in the school system, then the ministry has something called bases curriculares, which is like basically 4 or 5 statements per academic year for each subject. And they say, well, this is what the students should be able to do.
Okay.
From there,
So
then they write something more specific called the study programs. They used to be called planning program. Now they're called the study programs, and it's a very detailed specification of what goals and competencies the students should develop. And then based on that, the Ministry of Education say, well, now there are these companies writing textbooks, okay, write them, and then we choose which textbooks are best, and then we let the schools decide between one or two.
So the school has.
Yeah, the school decides.
So the teachers are participating in that process of
Yeah.
deciding.
Well, that's the thing. I'm not really sure. It pretty much varies depending on the school. Sometimes it's something called the Unidad Técnico-Pedagógica. The
governance.
Not sure. So each school has this department called the pedagogical unit. So there's one person there that they might make that choice. But I remember when I was a teacher in Chile, I was shown the textbooks and I was made. They asked me to choose which one.
What about the books designed by the government?
Oh, those. Yeah.
Mm.
Those, yeah.
So regarding the last point in your discussion, don't you think that textbooks in general are empowered by authority and how they affect teachers, how they tend to be like very legitimate, is empowered by the authority? Do you understand? I'm not very clear about it, but it seems that textbooks tend to be, from the way you present it, or from how I understand it,
Yeah.
tends to be like empowered.
Empowered.
Yes, by the authority.
Or promoted.
Or promoted.
Promoted. Yeah. Or imposed.
Could be. That's why teachers rely on them just to save themselves, isn't it?
Well, I acknowledge that being a teacher is hard and that you don't really have much time to design. Hence why I'm focused on how pre-service teachers learn to write the materials, because they're at a stage of their professional lives where they're required to show that they're able to demonstrate ability or capacity to write or to plan lessons, to write their material, and to enact teaching. And so I'm not, even though it would be very interesting to know how the teachers use the textbook and why they rely so much on it, I'm more interested in knowing how the pre-service teachers, why do they rely on that when they have the chance of not?
I'm speaking about pre-service teachers and teachers, sorry.
Are you talking
Yeah,
about?
I was referring to pre-service teachers.
Pre-service teachers.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I also acknowledge that because the textbook is used as a curriculum, then there's a national imposition in using the textbook as not a tool. And here we have another contradiction, a primary contradiction, when the textbook is not only a tool mediating the teaching of English, but the goal of teaching English.
Okay.
So what happens is that in the end, the teachers teach the textbook. And that's why some teachers say, you have to do it like the textbook, and they say that to the pre-service teachers. And the pre-service teachers have no choice but to do that. Some of the teachers are more relaxed about that, and they say, just see the textbook and see if there's anything you like. Or some others say, no, just write whatever you want. But what I'm focusing here is how this phenomenon of making the pre-service teachers rely on the textbook, how that happens. Because some of them are free to.
Yeah, I kind of think it's really complex. I think I often think in schools over-reliance on a textbook is to do with time and resources that the teachers actually have, and they, the textbook is a safe tool to use.
Yeah.
And it also creates a distance between the teacher and the student, so it kind of becomes depersonalised.
Yeah, yeah.
So if something goes wrong or people fail,
It's a textbook.
It's not me. But I think also with students, with the pre-service teachers, there's that kind of that tension between the creativity that they are allowed to have and what they see as actual current practice. It becomes kind of perpetuating, well, if the teacher's doing it, then I'm going to do it, and it's a safety net.
Yeah.
But again, it stops them being exposed. It stops that kind of.
Yeah, well, that's the type of, for example, phenomenon that I would be very much against because and it has to do also with trends in TESOL or TEFL at times.
We've got about 5 minutes.
And it has to do also with trends in TESOL or TEFL. For example, many native speakers are given jobs without any teaching qualification just because they have the linguistic competence, and then the excuse basically the element, refining the teaching abilities is the textbook. So, and well, you've got the textbook there, you speak the language and go and teach it because you've got the textbook. So in the end, what I see is that the image of the teacher as a mediating element of teaching is starting to disappear, and then the textbook is becoming what the teacher used to be.
It also, sorry.
Sorry.
I was gonna say, it also is two things very briefly. It also transfers to children because it becomes that things of if you walk into a class and say get your books out, they're like, oh, it's a lesson.
Yeah.
If you say we're doing something else, they're like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
And I was also then thinking the point that you made about teachers teach based on their own history and their own context. That's how most of us were taught.
Yeah.
And so it ends up being the default position of, I'm okay, I've got the book.
Yeah.
So however much we fight against it, I think there is that inculcated from the way that we learned. If it was a book, it was a proper lesson. And if it's not the book, it's not a proper lesson.
Yeah.
And it's quite hard to disengage or relearn different practices. Even by the time you've got to university, you've had how many years? 18? Like a few years of being taught in that way. So I think you're pushing against a whole upbringing in a sense.
But
however much we intellectualize what we should be doing it's very hard to fight against that.
Yeah, but then you also have the whole textbook industry pushing to make teachers dependent on textbook. So because that only benefits who wins. Someone says, who wins? Alfonso would ask, who wins? Who benefits?
But I think there's very much when your goal is to learn a language and you want to become culturally you aspire to also meet the culture of that language and all the cultural artifacts that surround that language and represented by pop music and represented by film stars. You've got the whole imagined community of what English is, which is embodied in a textbook. So you can sit and talk to your teacher who's their first language is Spanish, but if I jump into the textbook, I'm jumping into the culture as it is imagined by a producer, a textbook producer, which is very uncontroversial, nuclear family, I don't know, heterosexual. I mean, it does not really represent.
Yeah, that gets more into
reality.
Into this chapter that I want to, that I have already written about, but not really written as a chapter. But it's because pre-service teachers. I mean, because most of the people that I interview, they pay more attention to grammar and to the language. Then they say, well, but actually, what we speak about is not important, but it's. Gabriel, he said that actually. He said, you know what, it's like this whole thing about English and the levels is like, it doesn't really matter because he said all that boils down to is grammar and vocabulary, and then if we speak about jobs, it's about grammar for jobs or vocabulary for jobs and so on. And he was like, oh.
Is it related also to identity? Like, for example, when you're a pre-service teacher, you're not like, or they see themselves as incomplete subjects in a way? Like they're not good enough to create materials?
I don't have material for this or as in evidence, but I would very much, write a different PhD about the construction of a teacher identity through the use of the textbook.